Museum of Uncut Funk, and I'm here to interview Robert Schnakenberg, who is the writer for Spoof Comics parodies, which include Fantastic Femmes, X, Babes, and Soul Trek Book 1 and 2. So Robert, let me start with, I'm a huge fan of 1970s black culture, and I feel like you have me beat. What impact did the 1970s have on your life by virtue of film, television programming, books, ads, and so on?
It had an immense effect on my life. I was born in 1969, so I was weaned pretty much on the culture of the 70s. Saturday morning cartoons, sitcoms, Saturday Night Live, the music of the period, punk, funk, disco, whether it was on the radio or in my record collection. Pretty much everything I am is a product of the 70s, and it's a period that I just find endlessly fascinating, really more fascinating than the 60s or the 80s, the two decades that bookended it. So I keep going back to it, and anytime there's anything 70s related on TV, I always find a way to watch it. I mean, I think I've seen all those shows from the 70s, from Space 1999 to, all the cartoons and science fiction shows from the 70s I'm just obsessed with. So it's pretty much what made me what I am today.
You mentioned funk music. Any particular groups that you like?
Parliament Funkadelic is a huge, James Brown, the OJs, the Ohio Players. I have all those funk collections. So those are some of the big ones for me.
Tell me, are you a Star Trek fan? Are you a Trekkie?
Huge Star Trek fan, yeah. Have been since I was, so high, watching it with my dad. Growing up in New York, they used to show them on Channel 11, the local station here in New York, at like 6 o'clock on Saturday nights. They used to have midnight showings. They would show Star Trek at midnight, and then the Twilight Zone was right after that. So in the summers, I would stay up late and watch Star Trek and the Twilight Zone, like a 2-hour block every night. So the original Star Trek was huge. Watched that with my dad. Became a Trekkie. Went to some conventions when I got older and got to be a teenager. And later, actually working for this comic book company that produced the Soul Trek comics, which we're going to talk about. Probably the first thing I ever wrote that was published was a Star Trek episode guide. It was an illustrated Star Trek episode guide where I would write reviews of each episode of the original series of Star Trek, and then the artists would kind of do all watercolors of the cast members and illustrate the individual episodes. So that was actually how I got my start as a writer, was writing about Star Trek.
And your love for Soul Train?
Yes, Soul Train was huge. Growing up as a white kid in the suburbs on Long Island, there weren't a lot of places where you could hear the type of music that was on Soul Train. It was like something was, being beamed in from a different planet. So, I mean, again, it was on every Saturday morning. I think it was like at noon or something. It was on Channel 9. You'd watch your cartoons, and then I think probably when I was a kid, I got hooked in by the animated train. I just loved the animated opening of Soul Train, just kind of, before I even knew who any of the artists were. That kind of captured my attention. And then just hearing the kind of music that you didn't really hear on pop radio out in the burbs. We'd have like rock radio. But it was a place to hear, people that I wouldn't necessarily hear and be exposed to different artists. So Soul Train was big. I mean, I probably watched a little bit of American Bandstand, but it was always kind of vanilla, and I wasn't that into it. But Soul Train was big, and Don Cornelius was such an interesting personality. The guy just popped out of your TV screen, especially when you were a kid. That I was a pretty loyal Soul Train watcher for most of my childhood.
I think that's one of the things that I love so much about the 70s is that it wasn't, although we came out of the 60s, civil rights movement, Black Power movement, everybody benefited from what was taking place in the 70s. So it wasn't that it was just, people of color who benefited. White folks benefited, and it just seems like we had a merging of people and a melting pot of all of this fantastic flavor that was going on, and everybody was digging it.
Right.
And I think that's why, for me, I'm stuck in the 70s.
And then the movies of the 70s, I mean, I can't think of a decade that had better, Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola, you know, all the great auteur directors of the 70s who really, you know, you didn't have that Hollywood machine that you had in the 60s and that kind of reemerged again in the 80s where the studios controlled everything. You know, there was really a lot of visionary screenwriters and directors who just kind of took over the industry. And there were, you know, the thing about the 70s was the really, really good movies were also the huge box office hits. I mean, The Godfather was a huge hit, and The Exorcist was huge. You know, now, you have indie movies that don't make any money. They might be great, but, you know, hardly anyone sees them because the audience has become just, you know, so stratified and chopped up into cineasts and then people who just go to see popcorn movies. You know, in the 70s, the popcorn movies were the movies that were winning Oscars and that really made a lasting impact on the movie industry for all time. So it's just like a rare moment in culture where stuff that was actually good was actually mass entertainment.
Absolutely.
You know?
And it's interesting because if you look at the type of movies that are made today, they seem like they're all going back. You know, not even to be creative to make new stuff, but just recreating stuff that was so good back then. Right. You know, updating it and making it today.
And it's just been taken over by. I mean, every movie now is just an advertisement for toys. I mean,
Exactly.
It's just a way to sell toys or candy to people. You know, there's no integrity of effort on the artistic side to make movies that are good anymore. And at least not ones that a lot of people get to see.
Tell me, how did you come up with Soul Trek? What went through your mind to sit down and actually merge these two entities together to create this, in my opinion, fantastic comic?
Excellent question. As I say, the guys who ran this company was a very small company based out on Long Island. They were big Star Trek fans, and as I said, I did a Star Trek episode guide for them. They also, part of the way they made their money was publishing adult comics. They had a series called Sex Trek, which was an adult Star Trek mashup. I didn't write any of those, but they sold really well and helped that company establish itself. So they wanted to kind of go legit and move in sort of a parody direction. So we were just kind of trying to come up with an idea that we could use Star Trek and spoof Star Trek, but add something else to it. And I guess I was the one who came up with Soul Trek, and just merging Soul Train and Star Trek. It just seemed like one of those chocolate and peanut butter kind of combinations, and we kind of brought a little bit of the flavor of the old Mad magazine to it, and that's you know, what we tried to create. We had very young artists who were just out of you know, the School of Visual Arts, and this was like their first job in the comic book industry. So some of the art, especially in the second comic, is very raw. It's very, you know, they're still trying to work stuff out and find their style. And some of it is a little bit on the amateurish side. And the writing, I have to say, in going back and looking at these, I can see how I've improved as a writer over the years, shall we say. But you know, it seemed reading it that it was very fresh. I mean, I was really coming out of my love for Star Trek and Soul Train together, and so it does still amuse me to go back and read these today.
Well, I have to tell you, the cast of characters that you put together in these, at least book one, well, actually both books, I just think was brilliant. The ship's captain is Don Cornelius, the first officer is Commander Brown, ship's counselor, Kaz, the communication officer, Whitley Houston, and it's all pronounced or spelled phonetically, and the security officer of all people, Lieutenant Tyson. I just thought this was brilliant. Can you go into a little bit more how you decided to pick these particular actors to play or to be seen in the comic books in these roles?
Sure. The first bit of trivia is that, I mean, we originally used, I think, all the real names. So it was Don Cornelius was the captain. And then I think the publishers, at the last minute, got a little skittish that somebody might sue us. So we had to go in, the letterer had to go in and change all the lettering on the speech bubbles to change it from Cornelius to Cornelian, and from Whitney Houston to Whitley Houston, or whatever it is in there. So that was a last-minute change. As far as choosing those particular people, it's a mix of, these came out in like 1992, I think, so you're flashing back to African American culture from that time and who was huge at that time. And it was MC Hammer and Whitney Houston, and Mike Tyson was always in the news at that time, still is, but more so then. And then it was like the iconic people, the people you had to put in there, like James Brown, Don Cornelius, obviously, Bill Cosby, who was a personal favorite of mine from my childhood, somebody whose records I listened to incessantly when I was a kid. So I had to get him in there. So it's a mixture of like the kind of eternal icons of black culture and the people who were really big at the time I was writing it.
So, let's talk about book one. Now, I have to be honest with you, when I opened up the book and I saw the spaceship, and it said USS Colt 45, and then I saw NWA on the bottom of it, I didn't know if I wanted to be offended. And before I allowed myself to go there, I read the comic book, and I have to tell you, it was brilliant. I don't think I would have done a better job, or even probably would have gone there if I were in your shoes. So talk to me about the first book, and how did you come up to name the ship USS Colt 45?
Oh, that's based on the Colt 45 malt liquor.
Right.
Children of the 70s will remember Billy D. Williams used to do commercials for Colt 45 malt liquor, and he kind of played on his sort of playboy persona. It was like the tagline was like "works every time" or something like that. So that's where that came from. I like to put things in here that really real aficionados of 70s culture will get, and maybe not everyone else will. So we needed a name for the enterprise, and I guess Colt 45 was what popped into my head. So that's where that came from. And I guess I see now, looking at the cover, that the ship is actually a malt liquor can, is what it's shaped like. It has a pull tab. So
I didn't even notice that.
Yeah. I'm sure I didn't.
How brilliant!
I'm sure I didn't describe it that way. I'm sure that was one of the artists who decided to
that's
add that in. As that sometimes they add stuff in that really contributes to the feel.
Well, you know what? I'm gonna tell you something. The whole NWA. After I got finished reading the comic books, it was just fitting. They were badass. They were badass in their time, and what better way, for those who get it, to make that association. When did you come up with the idea to put NWA on the ship?
That would have been me, yeah. I mean, we're going back 20 years, so but I was a big NWA fan, particularly their first album, which would have been out around that time. And as you know, on Star Trek, it's the Enterprise is the NCC 1701. So NWA seemed like a logical fit, so we went with NWA.
So with that in mind, I know the only rapper per se was your chief engineer, Jack Hammer. Yes. Did you give any thought to using any other rappers in this comic book?
Probably, yeah. I mean, at that time, I would have been a fan of NWA and Public Enemy and the Beastie Boys and Run DMC from that period. So, if we had ever gone on and done more issues of the comic, more than the two that we did, I'm sure they would have turned up eventually as villains, if nothing else, if not regular crew members.
Cool. Commander Brown and Lieutenant Tyson. I have to admit, I love the way you captured them, writing down the way that they speak.
Yes.
And I found myself having to go back and try to immerse myself in the character within the book and try to speak like James Brown would have spoken, and or Mike Tyson. And I just have to tell you, I thought that part was just outstanding.
Well, I think we even have a James Brown translator for people who can't understand James Brown. We have kind of a universal translator in there that translates James Brown's speech into English. So he has a very distinct way of talking, as fans of James Brown know.
Yes, absolutely. And the whole scramble board was outstanding when they, came into contact with this alien ship and wanted to know who was coming. And then here comes the captain, Don Cornelius, telling the kids, figure out what's going on, tell us who's coming. And they're at the scramble board. I was like, oh my God, this man has captured everything. in this comic
Well,
book.
credit also has to go to our editor-in-chief at the time, Kirk Lindo, one of the great African-American comic book artists of that period, still working today. We sat down and had a sort of story conference at the beginning of this, and we went through the elements of Soul Train that had to be included in the comic. You know, all the Don Cornelius catchphrases that we had to get in there. And I think it was him who said, you know, you got to have the scramble board, because this is something that anyone who watches Soul Train is instantly going to recognize, and you have to put that in there somehow. So I'm sure I came up with a way to work it into the storyline somehow, but it was a collaboration between the two of us on that one.
Oh, well, it was outstanding. I love the way you did that. You know, I want to touch base on the Tyson-Robin Givens marriage.
Yes.
You know, it kind of left me feeling like I was shaking my head, but, you know, again, I understood,
Sure.
you know, why it was in there. When you were writing it and going through this process, did you have any feelings like, should I be touching this? Should we put this in this comic book?
Right.
How do you add humor to something that was really kind of tragic?
Mm-hmm.
You know, but then when you step back and look at it so many years later, it is kind of comical in a sense, and I hope I'm not offending anybody, but...
Right. I think we had to include it because it was probably in the in the zeitgeist at the time I was writing it. So if we were going to put Mike Tyson in the comic at all, we probably had to address it somehow. And I think, you know, our buzzword was to try to be as irreverent as possible. So we weren't going to be politically correct at all and sort of stay away from certain topics that were in the news. I mean, I think I'm a pretty ethical guy, and I would use my own sort of ethical filter as to when I would think I was crossing a line and it was getting offensive, and then I would know to pull back. So, but we were trying to be a little bit offensive, but not cross a line where we really turn readers off. So
Okay. So let's move on to book 2. The crew is on shore leave, and they're on this planet where their dreams, thoughts, and fantasies turn into realities. How did you arrive at that storyline?
That's a storyline from an episode of the original Star Trek called Shore Leave, where the crew goes on shore leave at this mysterious planet, and everything that kind of goes through their head actually comes about in reality. If they're thinking about a knight in shining armor, one will suddenly appear. So it's a very well-known episode of the original Star Trek, and probably one of the favorites of the fans of the show. So in looking for different episodes to parody in Soul Trek, that was an obvious choice. So and it just lends itself to so many interesting ways to take the characters in different directions and have different ones have different fantasies that then become reality. And we had Jimmy J.J. Walker in this one, kind of living out his own fantasy as the captain of the ship. So it was just a natural choice to make for an interesting storyline and get a lot of the different supporting characters involved.
Well, I thought it was really cool how the captain, I guess he wanted to always be John Shaft, and
yes,
obviously Billy D. Williams.
His turns up in there, yes.
Yeah, and then his little brother, Little Richard, as a ballerina.
Yes,
brilliant. Loved it all. Loved it all.
And Spike Lee, we should mention, is also in this one.
Absolutely.
Another favorite of mine. Another person who was huge at the time. Obviously, still working today, but from 1991, 92. If you were going to do a comic book, at least you have to have Spike Lee in there. So
yeah. Well, I have to tell you, kind of touching base on book 1 again, I thought what I loved the most is how the captain did his send-off, which is so, in line with, Don Cornelius and Soul Train. Bet your last money it's going to be stone, gas, honey, and in parting we wish you love, peace, and soul. I guess I just can't articulate what this comic book has done for me personally. Taking me back to a time in which I'm so stuck in that I don't want to leave. And, having the opportunity to sit here and talk to you and meet you and, get a better understanding of, your experiences in the 70s and what brought you to this. I just think, everyone should read a copy of this. Everyone should have it in their collection, if you're fans of the 70s. And I just think this is brilliant work. And, I'm not just talking out the side of my face. I really love these comic books.
I really appreciate that. I was just, my wife was just telling me as I was telling her I was going to come and do this interview, it's amazing that 20 years later, people still remember this and remember it fondly and would want to come and interview you about it because, it was a small company. They did become reasonably successful during the kind of gold rush period of comics in the early 90s and made, actually at one point I think we were like the 4th biggest comic book company in America for a brief period of time. But, you know, obviously these things the company kind of went away, and you can only really find these comics on eBay now. They're not widely available. You have to really seek out copies. But every now and then I'll get an email out of the blue from someone who has read these or heard about them, and they're always very complimentary. So I definitely look back at them fondly, and I just wish they had gone on longer than just the 2 issues.
Is there ever been any time in your present life now that you have thought about maybe doing a 3rd edition of this?
I would love to. The company doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I probably don't have the rights to do it. I don't know if they're back in like the public domain or whatever. But I mean, there's so many stories you could do, and you could update it and have people from today in it. And obviously, a lot of these people are still around and still in the public eye. So you could certainly still use. Bill Cosby was just on Jimmy Fallon last night, apparently, and killed. So you could bring him back. Certainly.
Would you ever give any thought to doing like what is it called, a web comic?
I think it would work really well as a web comic. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think it would be a huge success. Absolutely.
The only problem with comics is you gotta find an artist to work with.
Right.
I can't draw.
Well, you're a brilliant writer. I'm telling
thanks.
you, did an outstanding job. I do want to touch base on the Michelle Obama 1-year comic book. I did manage to get a copy from a friend of mine.
Okay.
They wouldn't give it to me, but
You can have this one. I have tons of them. So
thank you so much. I enjoyed reading this comic book. Were you approached to do this comic, or was this something you came up with on your own and approached the company?
I was approached to do this. I had done some previous biographical comics for the same company. I'd done one on Barbara Walters and one on Bill Clinton. So they had actually done a Michelle Obama biography before they approached me about doing this one. They did one that was her life up to becoming First Lady. And then they came to me and said, we want to do one about her first year as First Lady. There was a Batman comic some years ago called Batman Year One, which was the story of Batman's first year as Batman. So that was kind of the peg that they wanted to work around, is, you know, if Michelle Obama were a superheroine and this was her first year fighting crime, you know, tell the story of her first year. So that was the impetus for that. First year as First Lady, and kind of give it kind of a superhero flavor, maybe put her in a superhero costume at the end and have her fly around. So that's what we did.
I enjoyed reading that comic book, but I do want to ask you, you mentioned that you were at Martha's Vineyard, the Yankee game, and the first state dinner within the comic. And so, you know me, I'm like, was he really there? So I have to ask you, were you really there?
No. There's I have been doing a thing with this particular company where I would write myself in as the narrator of every comic that I wrote. And in each one, I would kind of create a different absurd situation around my character as the narrator. So there's one where I like go to some kind of Aztec ceremony and get turned into a bird, and I'm just sort of like present in all these weird historical events that I couldn't have possibly been there for. So that was kind of a little storyline for people who had read all of the ones that I had written to follow, that I'm in every comic and I'm sort of injecting myself into the storyline. So I decided to do that here in this one and just make it as absurd as possible, that, you know, I'm at a state dinner, or, you know, I happen to be at the restaurant where Barack Obama and Michelle Obama are having dinner and I'm waiting their table. So it was kind of like, if you had read all the ones that I had written, you could see that this was kind of just a bizarre little in-joke that I put in every comic. So it kind of plays out to fruition in here, where I'm like involved in all these historical events that I couldn't have possibly been at.
Oh, I really enjoyed reading that comic book, and I must tell you, I am going to get some copies for my godchildren. They are very much into comic books, and, you know, we try to support them and really getting them quality comic books to read, and I think this is one that should be in their collection. You know, what I'd like to, before we close, touch base on is, what are you doing currently? I mean, do you have any graphic novels, comic books in the works, or are you writing any new books that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I'm the author of about 12 books, most of which are still in print. I have a book called Secret Lives of Great Authors, which is a nonfiction book of biographies of famous writers, which sells well for me. Another book called Christopher Walken, A to Z, which is an encyclopedia on the actor Christopher Walken. And one called The Encyclopedia Shatnerica, which is of interest to Star Trek fans, which is an A to Z encyclopedia about the life and career of William Shatner. So those are the ones that are kind of most well known that I've done. I haven't done any comic book work. I think Michelle Obama Year One was the last comic I've written. Comics don't pay very well. Sometimes they don't pay at all. So I would love to get back in and do more of that kind of stuff in the future. Right now I have a book out. It's called Crazy Shit President Said. It's a collection of outrageous presidential quotations throughout history, from George Washington to Barack Obama. So that's what I have out currently. And I'm working here at Random House as a copywriter, writing book jackets. So that's what I do to pay the bills.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you for taking time out, for allowing me and the Museum of Uncut Funk to do this interview with you. I think your comic books are brilliant, and I'm going to talk about them and encourage those who I know are collectors to get them in their collection if they don't already have them. And anything that you do that's comic book related, I would love for you to keep me abreast, and I will definitely put it on the site. And you know, we're getting a lot of traffic, and I would love to share that with our viewers.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bet your last money, it's all gonna be a stone gas, honey. Always in parting, we're gonna wish you love, peace, and soul.